She was a small-town girl who found the man of her dreams.
All of a sudden, you're hanging out with an NFL player. Man, that is something that you probably never thought you were going to do back in small-town USA.
He likes her. She's a great gal, wholesome. He sees this. She's a quality woman.
The next step was marriage, having the baby that they both wanted. What could be better than that?
But an unthinkable crime would expose the truth behind this celebrity romance.
I heard a woman screaming and then a pop, pop.
This was absolute overkill. This is personal.
It was a high-profile case that would lead detectives on a 2-year hunt to catch a killer, driven by jealousy and revenge.
This was an over-the-top infatuation.
You're thinking, oh boy, this is going to get really salacious, and it obviously did.
October 4th, 2007. Around 8 a.m., as most Chicago residents are getting ready for work, a frightened woman calls 911.
Deerfield Police. I'm so nervous right now. About 10 to 8, I heard a woman screaming and then a pop, pop, and it went totally silent.
Did you hear it out in the parking lot, or was it from a unit?
No, it had to be from a unit. I called my neighbor upstairs, and she does not answer.
Officers are quickly dispatched to the address, a condominium complex in Deerfield, Illinois.
Deerfield is a town on Chicago's North Shore. It's an affluent suburb. Very, very peaceful, very quiet.
This is where kids and moms and dads can walk the street at any time of day. This isn't where you find crime in Chicago.
When police arrive, they discover evidence of a fatal shooting.
She was in the kitchen area of her condominium that she was renting. At that point, it was obvious to the first responding officers that there were gunshots involved.
It was shocking because it's Deerfield, but even more shocking was that she was carrying her unborn child, and the baby was killed also.
It appeared, for all intents and purposes, that there was a belly shot.
But who would do such a thing, and why?
In a case like this, the first rule of thumb is to do the basic police work, which is knocking on doors and talking to people and asking them just basic questions. You just see or hear anything.
Investigators learn the victim's name is Ronnie Ryder. She was 7 months pregnant, and the father was well known in Chicago. She was the girlfriend of Chicago Bears legend, Sean Gale. Ronnie Ryder grew up in Potosi, Wisconsin. And like many small towns across the country, it's a place where people take their football very seriously.
She's just a wholesome, pure middle American girl.
There's not a lot going on in Potosi. I mean, the closest big cities are Minneapolis and Chicago.
But things picked up every summer when the Chicago Bears arrived for their football camp. Even in the sea of fans watching the team practice, a young woman as beautiful as Ronnie stood out.
According to everyone who knew her, she was just a beautiful person, inside and out. There were plenty of men attracted to her, but she wasn't willing to just settle down with just anyone.
Then in the summer of 1990, 24-year-old Ronnie caught the eye of one of the team's best players, 28-year-old defensive back Sean Gale.
He likes her. She's a great gal. She's wholesome. She's not some, just fly-by-night. He knows that. He's a smart guy. He sees this. She's a quality woman.
The feeling was mutual.
Sean Gale was a successful football player. He was good-looking. He was articulate. He was well-spoken, intelligent guy, financially successful.
Sean was not only handsome, he was also a star. A key member of the legendary Chicago Bears team that won the Super Bowl in 1986.
The members of that team, the coaches, people would stop them everywhere to ask for autographs. Everything they did was followed, and Sean Gale was a big part of that team.
It seems like he dated a lot of women in and around Chicago, and I can see why. He wasn't married, he didn't have kids, He lived the life, and I can see why that would make people attracted to him. He's a free spirit.
After a few years, Ronnie moved to Chicago to be closer to Sean and found work at a large fashion retailer. Over the next several years, their relationship continued to grow, but Ronnie never pressured Sean to settle down.
Sean and Ronnie dated for almost 2 decades. The strange thing was, though, they never lived together, and they never got married.
At the end of the day, they seemed to really care about each other. But it also seemed to give him a little leeway as to what he wanted to do as far as dating and seeing other women. It seemed to work for him. And I guess if two people are happy at the end of the day, why judge?
But in 2007, 18 years after they first met, that all changed when 41-year-old Ronnie revealed she had some unexpected news.
She was very trim, very fit all the time, you know. I said, what's going on? How's the nutrition going and everything? She told me that she was pregnant.
Sean had even told his mother about the pregnancy, and both his and Ronnie's families were thrilled.
He said he was looking forward to having a baby with her and picked out a name together.
The next step, probably, I would imagine, was marriage, having the baby that they both wanted, settling down, and just living in a town that loves you. What could be better than that?
However, any dreams the couple had for the future now lie in ruins.
The scene is absolutely horrible. I mean, she's lying there on the kitchen floor, and her hands are around her stomach like she was trying to protect the baby. There's even an ultrasound on the refrigerator. I mean, it's just absolutely heartbreaking.
Coming up, detectives learn more about the murder weapon.
They think that the killer used a silencer, and if so, this wasn't a crime of passion. This was an execution.
Chicago police have just discovered 42-year-old expectant mother Ronnie Ryder lying dead in her Deerfield condominium. And they're already feeling the pressure to solve what promises to be a very high-profile murder.
As it happened, one of the doors apparently that we had knocked on was an individual that worked for a Chicagoland newspaper. So I think within several minutes, there were news helicopters all over.
We hear Sean Gale's name involved in this whole thing. Oh man, it became a big story.
Inside Ronnie's home, investigators are collecting evidence to try and determine what happened.
There weren't any signs of forced entry or theft, so the investigators realized that either she opened the door for the killer or the killer had a key.
The location of the bullet wounds suggests that whoever shot Ronnie wanted to make sure they killed both the mother and child.
There was a belly shot as well as, a number of other shots.
The killer fired over 7 rounds. I mean, this was absolute overkill. So it became relatively apparent that this is personal.
There is no physical evidence. There is no DNA. There are no fingerprints.
And the evidence they are able to recover only raises more questions.
There were spent shell casings, which are consistent with a semi-automatic weapon being discharged, but then there were also bullets that had not been fired. So that was one of those things that we had to figure out, was it a malfunctioning weapon? So that in itself was strange.
Police determined that the shell casings belonged to a 9mm handgun, which would have been much louder than the popping sound the 911 caller described.
The type of noise she heard, they weren't outright gunshots, but she described something that was similar to it in a muffled sense.
They think that it was possible that the killer used a silencer. And if so, this wasn't a crime of passion. This was an execution.
Detectives canvassed the building, hoping to find an eyewitness. While no one saw the shooting, one of Ronnie's neighbors says they caught a glimpse of someone fleeing after the gunfire.
A person running on foot right around the same time that this would have occurred, dressed all in black. They described an afro-like haircut, and it was, they said, a dark-skinned male.
The neighbor tells police the man drove away in a black sedan, and there is one man in Ronnie's life who fits the description.
People didn't want to believe that Sean had anything to do with it. He was a member of the '86 Bears, and everybody loved him.
Maybe you don't want to be tied down. Maybe you don't want to be responsible for a kid. Did she do this to entrap you? Did she do this to keep you around? Is this the way she was going to get you to finally give her the ring? Without a doubt. I've got to look at him. I think it'd be crazy not to.
Detectives' suspicions only deepen when police find evidence that Ronnie and Sean's relationship was under a lot of stress.
They find Ronnie's purse, and inside was a letter accusing Sean of being a womanizer.
There was a list of females that apparently had some kind of a relationship with Sean Gale. And I don't know the exact verbiage in the letter, but generally it was like, do you know that he's having relationships with these women?
The letter she received indicates that Sean was having affairs with as many as 18 different women. Is it possible Ronnie confronted Sean, causing him to snap?
Everything pointed to Sean Gale. And I think since we were post-OJ, everybody's like, okay, well, here you go. We have another NFL player who's just kind of lost his mind. He's gone off the rails.
But before police can bring Sean in for questioning, he calls them.
This is Commander Kilhouse. Can I help you?
Listen, I've been getting calls from the media. This is Sean Gale, and they're naming me as a suspect.
Can I have you talk to an investigator?
Yes, please.
Okay, come to the Deerfield Police Department. Do you know where it is?
When investigators meet with Sean, he seems genuinely upset about the news of Ronnie's death.
Sean was cooperative. We had interviewed him for several hours and tried to establish a timeline as to where he was coming from, trying to either, eliminate him as a suspect or still keep him on the list.
Police confront Sean with the incriminating letter, but he assures them it wasn't a problem.
Ronnie knew what she was getting into, and she made her peace. Her not making a big deal about him dating other women was probably why he stayed with her for so long.
Not only does Sean appear to have no motive, he's also able to produce an airtight alibi.
Sean was at a barber shop in North Chicago. There's a barber there that apparently is a legacy amongst the Chicago Bears. A lot of them go there even to this day to get their haircut. Sean was there getting a haircut with another Chicago Bear.
Sean Gale was quickly ruled out as a suspect, and publicly. There was no hedging. They were like, no, he's not a suspect.
While Sean has been cleared, he does give police a new lead. Ronnie might not have been jealous of Sean's other lovers, but one of them was.
Sean told the police that he thought the killer might be the same person sending the letters, a Polish fitness instructor named Monica.
Monica Karowska was a woman who had dated Sean a year or two earlier, and it sounded like an unpleasant breakup.
Sean said that Monica had been bothering him at his apartment to the point of harassment.
Sean tells police it was soon after that incident that the other women he was dating began to receive the same letter.
Sean felt that because of the broken English, it had to have been Monica. That, coupled with her behavior, made Sean afraid that he wasn't sure how far she would go.
It was dangerous to the point where Sean had an order of protection issued against Monica.
Was Monica obsessed enough to kill Ronnie and her unborn child, hoping for another chance with Sean? Coming up, investigators question one jealous ex, only to find another.
This was an over-the-top infatuation.
She was jealous of Ronnie, and she was obsessed with Sean Gale.
Investigators in Deerfield, Illinois have determined that Chicago sports hero Sean Gale wasn't the one who murdered his longtime girlfriend, Ronnie Ryder.
Sean had broken things off with a woman named Monica who had begun stalking him, and he told police that she started sending letters to a lot of the women in his life, including the letter found in Ronnie's purse.
Although Monica doesn't match the description given by Ronnie's neighbor, detectives know that doesn't mean she wasn't involved.
They had a vague eyewitness description by someone who said they saw somebody running through the parking lot about the time of the shooting.
The neighbors said they saw a dark-skinned man, so clearly it wasn't Monica, but they couldn't get a good look, so it could have been anyone.
When police bring Monica in for questioning, she denies writing the letters.
Monica at the time was a private fitness instructor, and she was conducting a private class, and she had a rock-solid alibi.
The police confirmed that she was not a suspect within a couple days.
With no further leads, detectives turned to the letter found in Ronnie's purse, hoping it might shed some light on potential suspects.
The letter had a hard copy of all the emails that Sean had been sending to the other women. And whoever sent the letter somehow had the information, the phone numbers, and the addresses for the other women.
One connection is, where would somebody be able to obtain all of these names and addresses? And really, the one place would be Sean's computer.
When detectives ask Sean if any of the other women in his life had access to his files, he says yes. 40-year-old fitness model and real estate agent, Marnie Yang.
Marnie was not just someone he had been spending time with. She was also his business partner. So she was in his office regularly.
She had been married and been divorced for a while. She had 3 kids with her former husband when she met Sean Gale.
According to Sean, his relationship with Marnie was mostly business, but the two did hook up occasionally. In fact, they'd gotten together the night before Ronnie was killed.
Sean might have had a cold or a sick or something to that effect, and she had brought him some chicken soup, and, they had consensual sex.
Could Marnie have been the one sending the letters?
The police showed Sean a list of phone numbers and asked him if he could recognize them, and he could recognize pretty much all of them.
It seems Marnie had been calling everyone that Sean called.
She wasn't just meddling around in his relationships. She was causing chaos in other areas of his life. For instance, she was canceling hotel and flight arrangements soon after he set them up.
We talk about stalkers, and I believe there was actually a film made about that where somebody had gotten into a relationship with somebody, and the next thing you know, you've got a rabbit boiling in a pot.
A background check reveals this wouldn't be the first time Marnie acted strangely with the men in her life. In fact, one had even taken out a restraining order.
Marnie Yang was working with a program supposedly to support the police department. I believe that was also a front to meet and be around police officers she was sleeping with.
One of those officers, when he tried to break off the affair, she became what he described as very vindictive. He related that he was scared and actually had an early retirement from the police department and relocated his entire family because of that. So the red flags went up that if a veteran Chicago police officer is scared of this individual, it's very telling.
Had Sean Gale become the latest object of Marnie's dangerous obsessions?
Marnie Yang, she liked to brag that she was Sean Gale's girlfriend, but it was just wild sex.
At this point, investigators know it's not enough to make an arrest. And with the entire city of Chicago watching, police want to build the strongest case possible.
There's virtually no physical evidence at Ronnie's condominium where she was killed, aside from the shell casings from the bullets.
In a high-profile homicide like this, we weren't going to do anything until we had what we thought was absolutely 100% everything that we needed to make a rock-solid case.
Coming up, faced with the need to produce evidence, investigators get creative.
One of the tactics investigators use is they call them garbage pulls, grabbing the garbage bags and going through anything and everything of value.
And detectives will finally get a chance to hear what Marnie has to say.
Was there ever any conflict between you and Ronnie?
Two suspects have already been cleared in the murder of 42-year-old Ronnie Ryder. Now, detectives are looking into a third, another one of Sean Gale's many love interests. 40-year-old realtor Marnie Yang.
It appeared that she had been stalking Sean and interfering in his life. And according to the police, this is something she had a history of doing with her past boyfriends.
So far, detectives don't have any solid evidence linking Marnie to the crime, but Sean offers to help them find some. While Sean has been involved with many other women, it's clear Ronnie Ryder and their unborn child were special to him.
If you talk to Ronnie's family, they say that she was very much a family person, that she wanted that commitment. And I think by looking back and what we've learned about Sean Gale and Ronnie post all of this, I think that's what Sean wanted too.
Sean tells police he is willing to do anything he can to help them catch the killer.
He was very helpful to the point where Sean wore a wire for us.
He agrees to secretly record a conversation with Marnie, hoping he might get her to confess.
Could have been paranoid, or it could have been she was very, sensitive to the questions and exchanges that maybe Sean was acting a little bit out of character.
He wasn't able to get her to say anything remotely incriminating in the recording.
Detectives will have to find another way to connect her to the murder.
One of the tactics that investigators use is they call them garbage pulls, where you're looking for any type of evidence and the garbage is located in a public area, so we do have access without warrant to look at it.
The move eventually pays off.
They found evidence that she had ordered, I believe it was 2 books on how to make basically a do-it-yourself silencer for a handgun.
We found receipts from a Home Depot. It actually turned out that a lot of the components that were in these homemade silencer books were purchased by Marnie.
A homemade silencer not only explains the muffled popping sounds witnesses heard, it also solves one of the lingering questions about the crime.
Officers found bullets that had not been fired in addition to the spent shell casings. And it didn't make sense at the time, but an amateur making a silencer would cause a gun to malfunction like this.
Those were very fruitful garbage pulls.
Armed with this information, police bring Marnie in for questioning.
Was there ever any conflict between you and Ron?
I never met her. I never spoke to her. He was pretty good about keeping everybody separate.
And Marnie said she was fully aware of the situation with Ronnie.
He goes, there's a small matter of a baby. He goes, my baby. And I'm like, really? Okay. I'm like, are we happy about this? And I said, it's just like that. He's like, no. He's like, no. No. Like that. And I looked at him and I go, oh, so apparently the condom rule doesn't apply to everybody, huh? He got mad.
Just as with their previous suspects, Marnie appears to have an ironclad alibi.
I had come home to check on the kids real quick. I let them know that I was going to be going out to Christie's. And then I went back in the garage to leave, and the car wouldn't start. So I ended up not going out there.
Marnie was very clever. At a point, you almost thought that Marnie was interviewing the detectives to find out exactly how much information they had.
But when police pushed her for details about the mysterious letters, Marnie shut down.
You know, you had said that if there was a question that I didn't feel up to answering, that I could...
Okay, that's fine.
Can you call me anything?
You want to stop talking about it?
I want to stop talking about it.
When investigators try to verify Marnie's whereabouts, her children aren't sure whether she was home or not. Fortunately, investigators come up with another way to prove Marnie is lying about where she was the morning of the murder.
A lot of investigations are very chronological, very thorough, involve evidence, forensics, interviews, but a lot of it is luck. And in this case, we had an investigator on the task force who happened to go to a rent-a-car class that they threw to provide law enforcement with the ability to run names and variables in their database.
They found that she had rented a Volkswagen the day before Ronnie was killed.
In a lot of cases, murder cases, drug cases, the primary method of transportation is a rent-a-car. It's the perfect car because you rent it, you bring it back, and what's the first thing that they do? They clean it. By the time you discover that even that car was utilized, that car could be in a different state, could have been sold, could have changed hands 100 times.
The rental car fits the description of the black sedan seen leaving Ronnie's building. It had been returned only a few hours after the shooting. But that's not all detectives find.
The police traced the contact number listed on the rental car receipt to a disposable phone purchased by Marnie Yang from a big box retailer a week earlier. That phone had made at least one phone call near Deerfield the day of the murder. All of this information, the rental car, the burner phone, was really compelling. But it was circumstantial, and prosecutors want an airtight case. They want a confession.
Coming up, to catch their killer, police enlist the aid of her closest friend.
The mistake that most murderers make is either involving another individual or telling somebody about what they did.
Homicide detectives and state prosecutors are building a case against 40-year-old Marnie Yang for the murder of Ronnie Ryder and her unborn child.
It took the police almost a year to put all these pieces together to implicate Marnie. But they needed more. They wanted that one final bit to make sure the charges stuck.
While reviewing the documents Marnie filled out to rent a car the day Ronnie was killed, detectives come across something odd.
She used an address out in the suburbs, even though Marnie lived in the city in Chicago.
The address belongs to a woman named Christy Passion.
We knew that Christy was a very close friend of Marnie's, somebody that Marnie trusted. There was probably some knowledge on Christy's part regarding what had happened to Ronnie Ryder. We have a saying in homicide investigations, we don't believe in coincidences. Christy was brought in and she was interviewed. It didn't take too long to lay out the facts to her. And at that point, she admittedly said, yes, this is what happened.
She becomes a critical piece of the investigation.
According to Christy, Marnie was extremely jealous of Ronnie's relationship with Sean and saw her pregnancy as a threat. And Marnie had confessed everything to her in great detail.
This was a very planned and executed murder.
Marnie thought of almost everything: the silencer and an escape plan. The dark-skinned male seen fleeing the scene was actually Marnie in disguise.
Trying to describe a person who's in disguise running away, you're not going to get a really good description. Is it a male? Is it a female? She cleverly put her personal cell phone in a drawer next to her bed, and she bought what we call a burner phone, and she called her own phone from that burner phone at a certain time, which would indicate off of phone records that she was at home during these certain periods of time.
After the shooting, Christy said that Marnie put the murder weapon in a bucket of cement and left it in a dumpster somewhere in Chicago.
It's been quite some time since she would have disposed of the gun, and so the chances of finding it in Chicago in a landfill somewhere with layers and layers of garbage was next to none.
So far, Christy hasn't told police anything they can prove, but she agrees to help them catch Marnie.
Police persuade her to wear a recording device and meet with Marnie so they can get electronic eavesdropping on their conversation.
Of course, she's worried about being a conspirator in the case, so she agrees to it. And of course, you've got to be careful because Marnie is a very clever individual.
Wearing a hidden recording device, Christy meets Marnie for tea and ice cream at a local diner.
You can hear the noise of the restaurant all around them. Buzz of conversation, dishes being moved and clanked, and it's noisy, and they're whispering. So you have to listen very closely.
Mr. Harris, who had come to my house, threw down 2 papers on my table. and looked at me and went, "Just so that you know, this isn't all we have."
Okay.
I told him I didn't know anything.
If they had anything substantial, they wouldn't have been coming to you. They would have been coming to get me.
She wasn't being pressed a lot by Christy, and there were some general questions that were answered. We brought that back to the state's attorney, and the state's attorney said, "We'd like to get more detail. Do you think we could do this again?"
This time, Christy gets Marnie to talk about the murder. And once she starts, she doesn't stop.
The conversation is chilling. Marnie starts telling Christy in matter-of-fact, methodical detail how she carried out Ronnie Reuter's murder.
She opened up the door, and all she saw was a dark-skinned person with sunglasses holding a gun like this. And she started screaming. And I just let her. And I just started emptying her.
That second interview was absolutely astonishing because not only did she go over what she did in great detail, she actually described the shooting, how she shot, she aimed for the stomach.
I took maybe 1 or 2 steps into the kitchen to finish the job. I took one last shot and finished her. Her leg was sticking out into the hallway. I had to kick it inside. I had gloves on, close the door behind me.
She took a photograph of the embryonic scan, and she also, which we didn't even realize, took a bracelet that Ronnie wore, a pregnancy bracelet.
She'd come in here, and she was pregnant, and she still worked out. She wore that medical bracelet, and every time she walked in here, I noticed it was on.
With Christy's help, police are able to recover the bracelet.
Marnie described having Christy drive around and burying that bracelet in rolling meadows. Finding that bracelet was an extraordinary piece of evidence.
On March 4th, 2009, police finally arrest Marnie Yang.
Detectives arrived at her home early in the morning and waited for her to go to her vehicle. As soon as she went to her car, several detectives took her into custody.
Because of the shots deliberately aimed at Ronnie's pregnant belly, Marnie is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. When police execute a search warrant of her home, they find even more evidence of Marnie's jealousy and obsession.
At some point when she was at Sean's house and he left the room, Sean's computer was not passworded out, so she downloaded the data onto a thumb drive.
It's proof that Marnie had been sending out all these letters to the women that Sean had been romantically involved with, including herself.
When news of Marnie Yang's arrest and the details of her crimes are made public, the city of Chicago is stunned.
The whole thing was very surreal, just surreal. It just wasn't anything she would get involved with. It wasn't anything she'd want to be around.
You start hearing, okay, beautiful girl that was tragically murdered, NFL star, and now Marnie Yang is in custody, and you're thinking, oh boy, this is going to get really salacious, and it obviously did.
Now it's up to state prosecutors to make sure the killer is brought to justice. Coming up, before the trial even begins, Marnie's defense makes an unexpected move.
It could have major consequences for the prosecution.
Their case rises or falls on the Christy Passion tape.
Investigators have spent nearly 2 years building a case against Marnie Yang for the murder of 42-year-old Ronnie Reuter. Police believe Marnie murdered her pregnant rival in a jealous rage. And taped conversations with her closest friend prove it.
When she opened up the door, that's when I thought of the gun. And I just let her in. Just let her in.
We had over 200 pieces of circumstantial evidence. This was probably one of the most rock-solid cases that I've ever been involved in.
But before the trial begins, the defense motions to have the tapes thrown out on a technicality.
This is why you hire a defense attorney. It's a minor, petty, jurisdictional argument, but if successful, it can have major consequences for the prosecution.
There is no physical evidence. There are no eyewitnesses. Their case rises or falls on the Christy Passion tape.
Unfortunately for Marnie, the judge doesn't rule in her favor. The tapes will be allowed as evidence. On March 1st, 2011, the trial begins. Prosecutors portray Marnie Yang as a woman driven by obsession, willing to do anything to keep Sean Gale for herself.
The two tape conversations with Christy in the restaurant were just convincing. You heard those and you realized that Marnie was in serious trouble because it was extremely detailed.
Christy Passion had taken the stand, and she indicated that Marty had confessed to her that she wanted to kill Ronnie because she was jealous. Ronnie was having Sean's child, and that made her special in a way that none of the other women were.
The defense argues that police singled out Marnie from the beginning with no evidence to back up their assumptions, ignoring the 18 or 19 other women Sean was sleeping with.
If much of that case is fabricated or colored to convict, and it's never tested, you'll end up with a result of a false conviction. The prosecutors and the police need to be told not to do that.
But prosecutors insist that of all the women Sean had been involved with, only Marnie was jealous enough to commit such an unthinkable crime.
We interviewed every female that we had obtained information about that had an ongoing relationship or even a past relationship with Sean. We interviewed every single one of them.
Marnie's defense attorney at one point said when Marnie and Christy got together to talk, it was a festival of liars. And he said flat out that you couldn't believe much of what either of them said. It was just two women talking in a restaurant, telling wild stories.
The question is, would the jury see it that way?
I couldn't see any way that this was going to be anything but a guilty finding.
On April 15th, after only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returns its verdict. They find Marnie guilty on both counts of first-degree murder.
She convicted herself by her own admission, her bragging to her friend who was wearing a wire, and gave instances and facts that only the killer would know.
There's no doubt in my mind that the jury got the verdict right.
3.5 years after Ronnie's murder, Marnie is sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Ronnie's family, it is a cold comfort.
There was a sense of relief, but there was also you could feel the anger that why was this necessary? You know, why did we lose not only a daughter, but people tend to forget a grandchild.
You just cold-blooded wiped out two human beings, you know, for no other reason than jealousy. As far as I'm concerned, she should have been executed.
I think it has to affect a guy like Sean Gale immensely. How do you get over somebody you love being murdered at the hands of somebody you were involved with? There's a woman who's dead. There's a baby that's unborn. At the end of the day, I just think it's really sad.